Yeah, so it's Friday evening here now in New York, just before the Labor Day bank holiday weekend. And it's fair to say that cleanup efforts are well and truly underway. For a lot of people, the shock of what's happened this week is just really still sinking in. The death toll's been rising steadily, and it's now at 49 across New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and also Connecticut. And that's according to the Associated Press. But at least six people are still missing, and that number is still expected to rise in the hours and days to come. Hundreds of people are still unable to stay in their homes. In fact, the Red Cross has said that as of Friday, it had housed about 400 people in temporary shelters across the region. So it's still very much looking like a disaster zone around here.
It really does. Why was New York as a city and as a state so unprepared for this?
Yeah, so a lot of that came down to the sort of very unique infrastructure of New York. It is a relatively old city. So a lot of the transit system, for example, the subway system, dates back about a century. And a lot of the stations hadn't actually been updated a whole lot in that time. So even though ahead of the storm, city and state officials had activated some preparation plans, they'd sort of cleared out drains and erected some flood barriers in the subways, for example, it just wasn't in any way really prepared for the severity of the weather. And the other thing to note is that a lot of New York is concrete and asphalt, and so that means that the runoff from the rain just went straight into the streets and into the sewer system rather than into sort of grassland, as would be the case perhaps in other cities or outside of the city.
Yeah, because I know New York have put a lot of money into sort of building up the banks of the river to protect that. But is it specifically because this was rainfall that there was so much damage then?
Yeah, I think it was the shock of the speed of at which all of this happened. The storm really started quite abruptly on Wednesday late afternoon. It started raining, and then it just got progressively heavier throughout the afternoon and into the evening. And as you say, New York City as a city has actually invested billions of dollars in storm protection since, particularly since Hurricane Sandy back in 2012, which affected more than 20 states, all right up from Florida to Maine, all of that eastern seaboard. But the type of storm that we saw this week is just so unique. And unfortunately, what we're hearing now, both from climate experts and also from governors and of the state of New York and also the state of New Jersey, as well as President Biden, is that this is probably likely going to be a sign of things to come.
Sandy was devastating in terms of financial cost as well as loss of human life. I think, was it up in the billions, the
Yeah,
repairs
yeah.
bill? What
Mhm.
what are we talking about for this?
Yeah, I think it's going to take a little bit of time to assess, the true financial cost of the storm. But I think it's absolutely fair to say, as well as the cost that, as well as the lives that have been lost in this storm, livelihoods are going to be, in the thousands that have been affected by this. And actually, the governor of New York, Kathy Hochul, who's very new in the role after Governor Cuomo was stepped down a couple of weeks ago, she has said that lots of financial aid would be available. She's been speaking regularly over the past sort of 24 to 48 hours with President Biden. And he's essentially said that, anything that needs to be made available would be made available, both in the short term, but also in the long term. I think there's really a realization over here that with climate change, we're going to have to be prepared for this sort of adverse weather in future. And actually, Bill de Blasio, New York mayor, he's also come out and said that New York would be taking more sort of long-term steps to increase evacuation orders, to implement travel bans quicker in future, and just to generally be more prepared for getting people particularly out of basement apartments when a similar situation like this arises in future, which it inevitably will.
It sounds incredibly scary, Josie, for people who are living there. Have you spoken to any families, any people that have been evacuated, grieving for their family members? How are they coping?
Yeah, I think one of the things that this has really underscored for me and for many people here in the city is just the extent to which New York is still very much shaped by socioeconomic inequality. So a lot of the deaths and a lot of the suffering that we've seen resulting from this storm has been in very sort of low income areas, parts of Queens, parts of Brooklyn, parts of the Bronx. And really sadly as well, a lot of the people who have who have died as a result of this storm were actually undocumented immigrants. So that's also going to mean that it's probably going to take a little bit more time to really establish what the true death toll is, because a lot of these people, were living here illegally, very much sort of under the radar. But that being said, this is a storm that has affected everybody. I was also speaking to some people in very wealthy parts of Manhattan today, whose apartments have just been completely flooded by this, and who will spend the next few weeks having to clean up what's happened this week.
Really? So it's affecting thousands and thousands.
Yeah, absolutely. It's affecting thousands and thousands, not just in New York. I think a lot of the media coverage has centered around New York because it's such a, important metropolitan city. It's such a trading hub as well. But I think it's important to remember that New Jersey has been very much affected by this. In fact, the vast majority of the deaths that have so far been recorded have happened in New Jersey, also in Pennsylvania and Connecticut. And as I say, it is those areas that tend to be low income that have been affected worst.
Yeah, I've been to both New York and New Jersey, Josie, and one thing that struck me was how many people live on the streets, the homeless population. What plans are in place to protect them, to look after them when the areas that they would normally frequent will be underwater?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the whole situation around the homeless situation in New York has perhaps also been exacerbated by the fact that through COVID, there was a real problem with many more homeless people on the streets. And I think that that's going to be a problem as well in terms of the fact that a lot of them won't have been accounted for. So the death toll could still rise a lot more. And naturally, this will raise a whole host of political questions around leadership in New York. As I mentioned, Kathy Hochul, the governor of New York State, is very, very new in the job. This was sort of her first opportunity to prove herself as a leader. But no one thought that it would happen so quickly. She's literally just sort of, got her feet under the table and on the ground after Cuomo stepped down a few weeks ago. So I think this will be really, really a test of things to come, both for the leadership at a state level, at a city level, but also at a federal level.
Thank you, Josie.
Yeah, Josie, stay with us because we're just going to speak to Nick Isabella, who's a storm chaser who will probably be viewing the events of the last few days with slightly different eyes to you. But I'd like you to listen into what he has to say. There might be one or two things that you come back in on. Hi, Nick.
Hi, thanks for having me.
No problem at all. Is storm chaser, is that the right job title for you?
Yep, that's correct.
Yeah. So what is it about storms, and why is it that you've dedicated your life to chasing them?
Ever since I was a kid, storms always fascinated me. I grew up in New York City, and when we got Hurricane Sandy in 2012, it had such an impact on my life and my family and friends. That's something I wanted to continue pursuing for the rest of my life. So now I travel the country going after hurricanes and tornadoes, blizzards, flash flooding, just to give people a sense of what it's like in the worst of these conditions. A lot of times people evacuate these areas and they're curious what's happening in their hometown. I'm able to show that to them.
And Nick, we've seen quite a few sort of aerial photos of the flooding, but what you're seeing there from sort of the eye of the storm, you're right in the centre of it. Can you give us a picture? What sort of things are you seeing?
Right now, I'm in the state of New Jersey. I'm just across from New York City, and there's many neighborhoods that are still experiencing major flooding from some of these rivers. Even though the storm was 3 days ago, a lot of people aren't able to return to their homes yet. They're just waiting for the water to go down. Some areas where the water did go down today, a lot of homes and businesses have to be fully gutted. So a lot of people were tearing out all their furniture, all their belongings, kind of putting it out to the curb and start to rebuild.
It's devastating, isn't it? I mean, you've seen lots of storms in your time. How extreme is this compared to others?
This is really bad. It's not exactly how much rain fell, but how short of a time that this happened. When I was in New York City the other night during the heart of the storm, we were getting 3 to 4 inches per hour of rain. So when you have a big city like this, there's really no way people could prepare for this, especially on a weekday during rush hour. You had people coming home from work, people going, home from school, and you're kind of just stuck on the highway with the water rising. There isn't a whole lot you could do.
How do you map them? And when you are mapping these storms and you know the likely path that they'll take, are you able to predict the severity when they make landfall?
This storm was a little different. Surprisingly, this storm was very well predicted 3 days ahead of time. The National Weather Service was very confident a few days before this storm that it was going to be a very impactful event. But as you get closer to the event, the forecast models become more and more accurate, and you could narrow down where exactly the worst impacts are going to be. Earlier in the day on Wednesday, before the rain started, I was actually in southern New Jersey chasing tornadoes, and I got to witness an EF3 tornado before returning back to New York City for the flooding.
It sounds like quite a life.
Yeah, it's very busy.
Yeah, very, very busy. This sounds like a quite perverse question, but what's been your favourite of the storms that you've ever chased?
I think my favorite thing to go after are hurricanes. Like I said earlier, Hurricane Sandy had such an impact on my life that's something I want to continue pursuing.
What was the impact it had on your life back then? I was in New York when Sandy hit. I know it hit Jersey as well, but I was actually in New York on a holiday, and our flight home was delayed because of it. There was still American football being played on the night where they said, don't cross the bridges. I remember it. We were watching it on TV. But why did that have such a profound impact on you?
I've always been a boat and ocean guy my entire life. I'm always working on boats, and I got to witness how quick the storm surge rose that night. And I've never seen anything like that in my life. It went up to 10, 12, 13 feet in a matter of minutes. And some meteorological event like that is very astonishing to me.
Wow, you're obviously deeply affected by that, and still are now. And what about other people that are there? You're on the ground. Are there families? How are people there coping? What is it you're seeing?
I realized today, after talking to many families and business owners in New Jersey, that a lot of people are still in shock of what happened. They always see these videos of flooding on the internet, but a lot of people never think that it could happen to them. And I was talking to some people today where they were trapped in their home, and thankfully everybody was okay. But once the water gets up, there's not much you could do. That's why it's very important to take all these warnings seriously. If the weather forecast is saying it's going to be bad in your area, it's best just to try to evacuate early before it's too late.
And are people responding in time? And are the cleanup efforts going well? Have you seen improvement over the last few days, few hours?
It's definitely getting easier to clean up today. We have a nice sunny day out. There's no rain. I think the next few days are going to be pretty clear as well. So that gives people ample time to clear out their homes and try to figure out how to move forward.
Yeah, it's going to take a lot for that to happen. Just bring Josie Cox back in, who we spoke to a few minutes ago, a reporter who's been listening to you, Nick. Josie, what is the mood among the people that you've been speaking to? Because I would imagine those that are still have their health, they still have their life, they'll be aware of the body count as a result of this storm, but the cost of it is going to live long for them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think overarching, it's still just very much an extreme sense of shock. You know, as you were saying, the images of kind of these absolute torrential floods entering subway stations, sweeping people away, and then those pictures that we saw, particularly coming out of New Jersey, of streets essentially having turned into rivers and rescue crews taking boats out to retrieve people from the roofs of their cars. These are images that we're just not used to in this part of the world, at least not on a regular basis. And so I think for a lot of people in the city that I've been talking to, it's just still kind of coming to terms with that, and almost like coming to terms with that trauma. It's also just been such a tough 18 months, not only in New York, but for everyone around the world with the COVID virus. And I just feel like this is, you know, particularly for small businesses, this is just something that they almost can't really wrap their heads around. Perhaps they had just found a more steady footing as some of the COVID restrictions have eased, only to then be completely wiped out by this awful storm. So it's just really a sort of quiet after the storm, a quiet sense of contemplation and reflection, and trying to just get your head around the fact that this has all happened, and particularly also the fact that this, you know, as many people are saying, may well be the reality of things to come. As I was saying earlier, de Blasio came out and said that, you know, this is a different reality. And I think his exact quote was that the speed and intensity that we saw this week has to be understood as a new normal of storms.
And Josie, after that reflection, I suppose, what is the presidential game plan now? I mean, Joe Biden has said this is a historic climate crisis. It's a matter of life and death. But it seems to be he's thinking more protection rather than prevention. What do you know anything about what will happen next?
So I think the first thing is obviously just going to be, making those funds and those financial resources available to aid all those cleanup efforts. Tens of thousands of businesses have been impacted by this alongside all the households. But I think in the long term, it is going to have to be a focus on prevention, because we do know that climate change is happening. We do know that temperatures are rising. And the truth of the matter is that hotter air around big metropolitan cities like New York just does retain more moisture. And I'm not a climate expert by any means, but that logic is very clear to me that if air retains more moisture, then these storms can happen much more fiercely and much more quickly. And as long as our climate keeps changing, that's going to be something that we're going to have to deal with.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, thank you, Josie. Thank you, Nicholas.
Thank you
Thank
for
you so
having me.
much.